The following program was provided by an independent producer solely responsible for its content. The opinions expressed do not necessarily represent the views of this station, its staff, board of directors, or underwriters.
Hi again, this is Ralph Bohm bringing you another update on Legislative Update. And haven't been for a while because don't do anything over the summer usually. But today I have a special guest today. It's Frank Edelbluth, the Commissioner of the Department of Education. Erica couldn't make it tonight. So anyway, but we know from past shows that the parental rights bill failed. But we found out parents already have rights. And we will discuss them tonight. And then we'll go over some building aid problems and the time permits, the primary date bill and a new bill that I put in for next year. But with that, first, Frank, will you explain RSA 186.11(9)(c)?
I would be happy to try and explain it. It's a fairly complex law, so it's important for people to actually read the statutes and understand what's in them. And then I guess I didn't know kind of all of that we're going to talk about, but I will point some folks to some resources.
Right.
So at the Department of Education, we try to provide information and resources to educators and families and students. And if you go onto our website, we have a number of different technical advisories. There is one that was released, I believe it was last year, that enumerates in all of the various places in statute, both federal statute as well as in state statute, of information that may be germane to parents who are trying to understand what their rights and responsibilities are with respect to the education of their child. And I would encourage individuals to reach out and take a look at that. You mentioned as well, specifically to the 189, 11 or 186.11 section, which is really a law that is about engaging families in the process of understanding and seeing what it is, what kind of content the students are exposed to. The statute is specifically centered around the terms that are used in there: human sexuality and human sexual education. And really, we know that these can be sensitive topics, and quite frankly, they're very values-driven topics, right?
Right.
Different people have different values about this, and so I think that the legislature in its wisdom saw that the best way to try and address that is, because of the various values and stuff that different individuals show up with, is to make sure that the parents have tools to be able to impose their values relative to their children, right? And so essentially what that law is doing is it provides a mechanism whereby when schools are going to be providing information with respect to human sexuality or human sexual education, that parents are notified that that content is going to be covered. At least 2 weeks in advance. They're able to review that material, make sure that if they have a problem with it, that they can provide an alternative educational option for their students, and so that everybody's can be respected in the process.
Right. When you say 2 weeks, that's for any subject where anything sexuality can come up in.
Correct. I mean, if you there's a technical advisory on my website. I happen to have a copy of it right here in front of me, and it enumerates kind of how that is laid out. But so it's not just specific. That statute is not specific to a human sexuality class or a health class or something like that. What we have to keep in mind is that it's really dealing more broadly with, and I think the law says, to the extent practicable, a school district shall make curriculum course materials available to parents and legal guardians for review upon request.
Right.
And then I go over to, and I look in the statute, if I go over to RSA 193, E2A or 6C, it defines curriculum very broadly. It means the lessons, which is something that we understand, academic content we understand, taught in school, not specific to a specific class.
Right.
But it also includes, or in a specific course or program, right? So there may be some other type of an extracurricular type of a program where these subjects would be introduced. And so, again, we're trying to make sure that we have an opportunity to respect the values of all of our families in this process and make sure that we're not exposing children to content that would be developmentally inappropriate, which really goes to another standard, which maybe we're going to talk about tonight as well.
Right. Yeah, because I remember when I was on the education committee up to this past year, that law 186.11.9C is, I was pretty much done in two parts. One, back when I was on the school board, there was some short stories in the textbook that parents said, "What the dickens are you doing? What is this?" It was one of the stories was a cocaine diet, and one of the reps tried to, from another town, because other towns ran into the problem too, tried to read it on the House floor. He wasn't allowed to, because the language wasn't. And then same thing with Governor DeSantis in Florida, tried to read a similar thing, and the camera shut him off. Hey, if you can't do it in public, I'm sorry, maybe it's not applicable. So then what happened in Manchester a few years later, when we added the 2-week thing in, is something happened there when they were trying to bring an outside group in to talk to the kids, and wait a minute, without the parents even knowing it. So could you put this up? Let me see. So here's what the law says. I mean, just what I outlined and read. The policy shall also require the school district or classroom teacher to provide parents and legal guardians not less than 2 weeks advance notice of curriculum course material used for education of human sexuality or human sexual education. That doesn't apply to any particular course. It's to any course. Well,
it's really focused not on the course, but the content.
Content,
right? Is what we're focused on. It's human sexuality and human sexual education, exactly.
Right.
Because again, going back full circle, I mean, these are, sensitive topics that different families share different values with respect to them. And so we want to make sure that we're respecting all of those families.
Right.
And so I think that was the intent. But you were the legislator who passed that, and I'm going to guess that's what you were trying to do. That's how we understand it as an agency.
Right. So what the Department of Ed consider sexuality and for kids learning in school?
Yeah, so we have provided a definition of that in our technical advisory. So the term human sexuality is not defined specifically in the statute, which the legislatures can go and do that. And so the department tried to, understand the statute in the basically plain language meaning of that term, which is the way that you're supposed to read statutes. Right. And so we actually use a definition from the Encyclopedia of Evolutionary Psychological Science. And it basically defines, it says, human sexuality is most broadly defined as the totality of experiences, systems, attributes, and behavior that characterize the sexual sensation, reproduction, and intimacy of Homo sapiens. Scientific perspectives of human sexuality encompass variously its reproductive, social, cultural, emotional, and biological aspects. So, the statute has very broad terminology, and so that's how we understand that. And so we went to find a legitimate decision from individuals who work in this space in terms of how we understand that law to be applied.
Right. So does that? So if a school is trying to teach gender associations, is that also covered?
Well, so you would imagine that gender associations, when they talk about scientific, this is in the definition, perspectives of human sexuality encompass variously. It's reproductive, it's social, gender is very much social, cultural, we've seen a lot of cultural conversation, emotional and biological aspects. So all of that really is wrapped up in here.
Okay. Well, that's what I thought, but apparently that's...
So when you say, I have a question for you almost then, so that's what you thought, but really you're the ones who, we're trying to read your statute and apply it. Is that how the legislature understood that when they were trying to pass that law?
Right, I believe, especially in the course material, but then we see things happening today that I think your directive really handles. We didn't know when we did this that there were going to be all this gender stuff in the school and whatnot, and so I think, that's basically what the directive, the advisory says is, if, for example, if a kid comes home from school with a textbook or a book talking about gender identity and the parents didn't know about it beforehand, they're really breaking the law.
Well, I think it would be appropriate at that point in time for the parents to engage the school and say, like, look, this is in the context of human sexuality,
Right.
Human sexual education, and so we think that this law, this RSA 186.11, would apply to this, and so, respecting the values of our family, we want notification
Right.
about this stuff when it is used in our students'
Right.
instruction.
Yeah, because initially, like I mentioned, the one book, we had to fill the auditorium when we were talking book burning, and that the phrase did, and people never even read the story. If anybody wants to, you can go online and look up cocaine diet, and you'll see the story.
What's really interesting, and I don't know
And
how
there's
much,
other ones
if you
too.
want to kind of weigh into this, but, kind of how we ended up here. Because really the idea of obscenity is, has a long statutory history.
Right.
And I'm not a lawyer, to be clear. I'm trying to practice as a lawyer, but we have a statute on the books, RSA 571B, which, criminalizes presentation or the exposure of students to obscene materials. When the thing that many people don't realize relative to that is when those laws were passed, both here in New Hampshire as well as in other states across the country, there was an exemption provided, among other things, to education.
Right.
And when they were providing those exemptions, much of the conversation really centered around post-secondary, like college students that
Right.
would be engaged in that process. But as really the objective was to try and make sure that we preserve the ability for educators to be able to provide, content and information. I imagine, and I don't have any information relative to this, that at the time, what we were trying to protect is Pride and Prejudice, and someone kissed a boy out behind the barn, and to say does it have literary merit? Does it have literature effect? And so that is the exemption, kind of this, the exemption that educators operate under at this point in time. I don't know that anybody imagined that some of that content would kind of evolve to where it is today, which is something to observe. But the second thing I think that's really important in that statute is, at the time when that law was brought about, it was really brought about, there was a portion in there that set out the process for determining what is obscene or not obscene.
Right.
And in order to determine if something is obscene or not obscene, the Attorney General or a county attorney can bring a matter to a judge, a court,
Right.
and present that to the judge, and the judge is the one who makes that adjudication, that determination as to whether or not it's obscene. And that part of the law was put in place really, and advocated for by educators. The school boards associations
Right.
back then, the superintendents, the principals association, the libraries association were saying, look, because they felt back then what was happening is that they were being pressured and attacked. And they were saying, look, we don't want to be brought into court because we've put 16 magazine on the shelves in the library. We need somebody else to decide. We just want to do our job, right? And so we will provide the content, but if we're not sure if something was obscene or not, there is a process in statute that can go through the court process to make a determination as to whether or not it fits that definition of obscenity. And so it's really interesting now how we had that's the process that the schools argued for now. And oftentimes I find in some of these local school district conversations about certain material, the school is saying no, we'll decide if it's appropriate or not, which is sort of feels like a 180-degree reversal from how we ended up to where we are now.
Right, and that's why I think when we put the law in is, hey, no, it's the parents have the final say as what their kids.
Well, and again, they have the final say because of the importance of those various value systems. Another concept that's not often addressed, which is in rule as well. So we have an Ed rule. It's in ED 306.8, and it requires the school districts to provide what is developmentally appropriate material. Right. So on the one hand, you're trying to respect the values of those families that are going to vary and be different in different communities. On the other hand, you really, as educators, we want to make sure that we are providing students with developmentally appropriate materials.
Right.
And so, because we know, quite frankly, in New Hampshire, across the country, we've got a mental health crisis going on with our young people. And when young people are inappropriately exposed to material that's not developmentally appropriate, it exacerbates those mental health problems for students. So we don't want to have that happen. And really what we really need to do is make sure, as you started this whole conversation about the parental rights, that we're engaging parents, because the parents and the families are the ones who are supporting those children through these different experiences that they have.
Right, that's why it's always been the thing when they first started teaching health, that parents got up their child out of sex education. I remember that's actually started when I was in high school back in the early 60s, and I remember the first book that came out, they went through it and everything, it was all the stuff that was redacted. It's like half the book was redacted because of the material in it. But now, and today, our school policy, IHAM, I believe, says for health, you can opt out, after, you got to give 2 weeks notice and the parent can opt. But that's not what the law says. The law says any subject, not just health. But that was the initial, is for parents that didn't want their kids to learn how to make babies.
So I would suggest,
Yeah,
Ralph, if that is a policy, that work with the local school board and the superintendent to just make sure that the policy reflects the laws as the legislature, as you've reflected it,
Right.
intended for this to be applied.
Right. So I would suggest that people look at school policies, IGE and IHAM, and see if they comply with what we were just talking about, the law. Because clearly IGE does not, because it just says that and the form for the parents to fill out if they don't like something in the particular curriculum, but the parents don't know what that curriculum is. They should. It's supposedly a policy that's online to look at.
So have you had a chance to bring that up with your local school
No,
board?
not yet.
Not yet, but
gotta
I think
do
that'd
it.
be a great place to
This is-
start.
right.
Yeah, go back to the superintendents and just work with them
Right,
to try
so
and get
say that
solutions
this-
that support all your families.
Right. So it's not just health for the 2 weeks notice, it's for any course material, or, that, because that book I was talking about, I was in an English class. And I look at it this way, maybe books should have ratings too, because the only way that story could have been made into a movie, it would have to be X-rated.
So I can tell you, there are a number of rating systems out there for books that are available, and they generally are rating them as, based on either grade bands or age bands for
Right. Oh,
students.
yes.
And
And
I
some-
think that's part of that developmentally appropriate. The reason that you have a rating is because, some, thinking about the movie ratings, like some movies are not appropriate. They're developmentally inappropriate
Right.
for someone under age 13 without parental consent. Because
Right.
the parent may recognize that, hey, I've got a very mature 12-year-old, right?
Right.
Or it could be that some materials, they're saying like, no, you need to be over 18, in which case, you're an adult and we live in a free society.
Right. Okay, so, we have some time left. Now, one of the things I want to discuss too is building aid.
Okay.
So what's your thing on how is building aid determined? And I have text on that too.
Okay. Do you want to share something
Yes,
first?
just a second here. Okay. Now here's for the current,
Am I supposed to be able to read that?
oh,
Okay.
but, but anyway, I'll just go over it. This is the amount of money what happened in 2011. The legislature then, which was not, I was in the legislature, but it wasn't my party, decided then that we're going to take all the building aid payments that we're doing, which has always been part of the budget, because they wanted to spend more money on something else. Let's bond all these payments. Now, to me, that's like saying, let's take a second mortgage out in the house to pay for our new car. You're paying off the second
Are you
mortgage.
telling me that Dave Ramsey would not be happy with that?
Right. Our treasurer was not happy with that.
Okay.
Okay, so what happened was, so now we're still paying off the bond. We're paying off, there was a 20-year bond, so it's not going to get paid off till 2031. So every year the legislature appropriates $50, $60 million for building aid. Most of that was going to pay off the bond. Now we're getting down to some nitty-gritty here where it's,
That's still real money, just to let you know.
Right. Oh, yeah.
Okay.
so now in 2024-25, which is this biennium, we have maximum aid for schools is $48.7 million. And then we have next biennium 60.7. You can see that starts going up because the bond payment keeps going down. And then 72.7, and then 86.5, and 93.4. But here's where the problem comes out, because Litchfield, for example, we're trying to build a new school, which some people say, do we really need one? We've been needing one for 30 years or more. But the problem with that is, if you look at Litchfield, is for fifth down on the list.
And what is this list that you're showing us, Ralph?
This is from the Department of Ed.
I think I'm familiar with it, but just for your audience.
Right, right. You can see here, that's Litchfield, okay, Griffin Memorial School, and the cost, estimated project cost is $32 million, and so we're gonna get 30% of that $9.6 million. But look at the schools above us. Now, how that works now, it used to be $9.6 million over the, say, a 20-year bond, but now it's going to be like the first year you get the money, and then most of the money, then the rest of it after the school's finished, and then, so it lowers your bond you're gonna have to pay. But the problem is, if we go back and look, you can see Rochester, $20 million. Colebrook, $9 million. Monadnock, $19 million. Concord, $70 million. Now, if you looked at the previous chart I looked at, it's gonna be a good number of years before we get up to that amount of money we need.
Well, there's no assurance that the process restarts, the clock restarts every biennium, right?
Right.
So,
Right.
somebody else might be evaluated as a more needy project, and
Right.
that may cause you to stay low on the list there.
Right, or somebody, it might be the other way. If school drops out, then you move up.
Yep.
But as you can see, we're number 5 on the list, and we won't get any money until about $220 million is sent to other school districts. So for those who think that putting a warrant article in this year is gonna work, you're not gonna get the money. So for the budget and the school board and the budget committee, I hope you put on the thing, only if
Contingent upon.
contingent upon getting 9.6 million and building a.
But I can tell you,
30%.
in that process, I mean, and oftentimes these votes on school building projects take a couple of times, right?
Oh, yeah.
They don't always pass the very first time. But I can tell you, it's also very useful when you don't want to be on the list and have funding available, and you haven't gotten your warrant article passed, because then it's going to drop down to the next guy below you as well,
Right,
and so you
right.
want to make sure
Yeah.
you're doing that.
Yeah, but when it comes time for it, for example, it's not time for it, I'm sorry,
Yeah.
folks. And it's amazing, I'm being blamed for not getting more money for building aid. Now, Litchfield, we have 2 reps, Rich LaSalle and myself. Out of 400, I have a lot of say on who gets the building aid.
Well, so what I can tell you, let me just describe the process a little
Right.
bit for your audience. I mean, so, each biennium we're running kind of this, a process whereby schools who believe that they have a need for building aid are able to make an application. There are forms and information that's required. It's enumerated in statute, how those are ranked. Right, so you in the legislature, you all have said, these are the important things that you have to weight in terms of doing it, and that's what we do. It's a very formulaic approach where we go through the process, we weight them, and that's how they end up. One ends up first, and you end up 5th, right? Because there are a certain amount of points that are scored and adjudicated for each of the different projects, and then based on those, then we go through that process. But as you pointed out, if the number 1 project doesn't have authorization to go forward, then those funds fall to the next project.
Right.
There are some fairly pricey projects above Litchfield, which is obvious in that process. But if it is determined that you're going to move forward in that process, again, it can sometimes take a couple of opportunities. There's a couple of attributes, though, when I'm talking to people about buildings and building projects. There is a demographic change that is happening here in the state of New Hampshire. Over the last 20 years, we have 46,000 fewer students.
Yes.
And
Litchfield itself, we used to have we had 3 schools, used to be like 500 each, now like 300 each.
Okay. So one of the things that I encourage communities that are looking at building a school is a couple of things. The first thing I ask is, consider the future, right? And what that might mean, it may mean you're still building a school, but the type of building that you're going to design is going to be one that is multi-purpose, meaning you can use it for something else. If in 20 years you don't need that elementary school, you've designed it, you've used a construction technique, which is probably not cinder blocks, so that it can be converted to a housing project or an apartment project or a commercial space at some point in the future, right? So don't lock yourselves into one style or something that doesn't have flexibility in the future as those demographic changes happen. And then the other thing that I often point out to communities as well, borrowing from the commercial world, right? Many large corporations, they don't even own the buildings that they're in. They lease those buildings.
Right, yeah.
And so there are a lot of, creative, lease purchase types of options where somebody else builds the building and you get to lease it from them for 20 years. They'll probably hand the keys over to you at the end of that period anyways. Right. And it may be that if you don't need it, that somebody else can have that. And so there's a lot of different ways to put this together. So it's important to really have a long-term perspective and consider, what are the demographics of the town? What are the educational needs of the town? What is the town? What do our surrounding towns look like in terms of what they've got going as well?
Right. I remember a couple of years ago, we tried to put a bill in for the Department of Ed. We put a bill in, and Finance killed it. Spent money that was already available for the Department of Ed to go rate every school with one set of criteria, and then go from there to see who needed it. But now it's trying to, who can put up the best story.
Yeah, but the difficulty with even trying to rate everybody, as I travel around the state, what you find is there's different community standards.
Right. Yeah.
There are some communities who maybe they need a new performing arts center every 5 years, and there's other tax-paying communities who say we're okay with folding chairs in the gymnasium for that assembly, right?
Right.
And so you really want it to
size.
reflect the community values in that process, which is really, that goes to, we're a very local control state, right?
Right.
We want to make sure, going back to the topic we were talking about before, what is the most local? Our parents.
Right.
And so local control means we're going to give parents a voice in the material that their children are exposed to. Here, we want to make sure we give communities a voice because those different community standards should be reflected in how they invest their taxpayer dollars.
Okay, I see we're running out of time, so a couple of fast things I wanted to cover. This past week, Tuesday, we had our last hearing in election law, and I put in an amendment on the bill which passed to change the primary date to the third Tuesday in August. Some people want June. To me, that's the most ridiculous thing I ever heard of. Anyway, so 16 other states do it in August. The Secretary of State wants August, so we'll see where that goes. Also, for next year, I put in just one bill, and those remember the motorcycle accident that happened in Derry, where 2 kids, one from Litchfield, 2 young people, was killed in a motorcycle accident. And a lot of people don't like what the Derry Police Department came out with their findings. So my bill is for, in small towns like Litchfield, if that happened, the state police will be investigating. But in big towns, they have their own investigating unit. So I have the bill in saying that the governing body, county attorney, or county sheriff can get the attorney general to send the state police to investigate. So, and I think if I was the chief of police, I would want someone, especially in a case like that, a second pair of eyes looking at it. So that's the only bill I have. So with that, thank you, Frank, for coming in.
Good to see you.
And hopefully we can straighten things out on our school policies. So hopefully we'll see you probably not until January or something when we start looking at new bills. Okay, good night. What a good day.
The preceding program was provided by an independent producer solely responsible for its content. The opinions expressed do not necessarily represent the views of this station, its staff, board of directors, or underwriters.